Up until the release of 2023's Resident Evil 4, I had never had experience with a game that I love getting remade. I thought I was going to have that experience with Final Fantasy VII Remake in 2020, but as fans of that series know, that game ended up not being much of a remake at all, spinning off into its own original thing instead. This time, though, I knew I wouldn't have that same experience because Capcom has an excellent record with their first two Resident Evil remakes. They're considered some of the best ever made because of their impressive ability to reimagine and modernize what made the original games classics while remaining faithful to the source material. And while 3's remake was not received nearly as warmly as the first two, that can mainly be attributed to the fact that it was handled by a smaller B team. Resident Evil 4 is a special case, though. While the original trilogy has long been revered as classics, 4 has continued to be highly acclaimed as one of the best games of all time ever since it first released back in 2005. And I have to completely agree, I love Resident Evil 4. I love the insanely fun shooting mechanics and how it pioneered the over-the-shoulder camera that would be used in practically every third-person shooter from that point onwards. I love the intensity that comes with every encounter because of the game's tight resource management. Speaking of resource management, I love that too. The Tetris-like suitcase here is such a great way to encourage careful planning in everything that you do. I love the game's tonal balance, which is somehow easily able to switch between intense and campy without feeling unnatural at all. I have a very hard time finding things to dislike about RE4. This reverence for the original is exactly why many argue that the game never needed a remake in the first place. For one thing, the original is still completely accessible with a notorious amount of ports to modern platforms, and for the most part, it has aged pretty well, with most modern audiences still enjoying it just as much as those who played it back in 2005. On the other hand, while it does hold up today, many of its defining traits are directly tied to the era it was released in. The campy tone and the feel of the shooting are aspects that feel distinctly tied to the mid-2000s, and before release there were concerns that those would not be preserved 18 years down the line. Personally, I agree that Resident Evil 4 never needed a remake, for all the reasons that I just mentioned. However, that definitely does not mean that I'm not extremely happy with what we got here. The Resident Evil 4 remake is a success on nearly every level, and while it never could have hoped to replace the original, Capcom have created an extraordinary reimagining of the 2005 classic that is able to stand right next to it. The most obvious and immediate difference from the original is the presentation. Now, I don't think the original looks bad by any means, especially given the context of the original release, but the remake does look much more up to par for a 2023 game. There's way more detail, which is a given, especially in the gore though, which the game really doesn't shy away from showing here. The hair effects in particular got a lot of extra attention, and it all looks fantastic. I like that the game is generally a lot more colorful than before, which I really appreciate, as the original was notoriously pretty drenched in brown. I will say that the one area where the game falls flat visually for me is the rain, which looks pretty atrocious, but it shows up so infrequently that I can't take too much issue with it. Sound design is fine for the most part, and it does a good enough job of keeping you immersed, but honestly, this is the one area of the presentation where I really miss the original ambience. The droning tracks in that game went a long way to creating a really great atmosphere, and I just don't get that same feeling here. The original soundtrack is available in the remake, but it's locked behind a paywall, which I hate. And still, even with the sound design being a downgrade in my opinion, it's far from bad. It's just more realistic and less creative. Presentation overall is definitely still a strong point here. I think the biggest question for many coming into the RE4 remake was what the game would be like tonally. Despite being a survival horror game, the original RE4 is extremely funny, mostly due to Leon's sarcastic demeanor. There's plenty of sassy dialogue and more iconic one-liners than I could possibly highlight, but if I had to pick a few...
I've sent my right hand to dispose of you.
Your right hand comes off?
Are you out of your mind?
I knew you'd be fine if you landed on your butt.
Since you're here, why don't I introduce you to it? It should keep you busy.
Can't remember the name, huh? A senior moment, perhaps. Where's everyone going? Bingo?
The remake, unsurprisingly, does tone a lot of this down. However, the team behind it was clearly aware of the love that many people hold for the self-aware corniness of the original. So while most of the original quips don't make a return, there are references to them in areas like the trophy names, and Leon is equipped with plenty of new one-liners, many of which happen in the middle of gameplay now.
I am flattered. I'm a one-lady type of guy. Sorry, must have slipped.
Hola, Luis here. You guys still around?
Well, I wanted to go home, but Ashley just had to see this castle first.
And at least they kept the most iconic one.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Alongside the tone of the original game, the story has often been called ridiculous or nonsensical. I never thought it was anything too noteworthy, to be honest. It served mostly as a base to build a bunch of fun moments and set pieces off of, but that was about it. The story has been kept largely intact, but there have been updates and additions to make it more interesting. This is most clear in the case of the characters, all of which have been given extra depth. Ashley definitely benefits from this the most. She went from an obnoxious damsel in distress to someone with a lot of agency who's willing to face danger head-on rather than running. Leon still acts the same as always, but also shows how deeply he was affected by the events of Resident Evil 2. Luis is given a lot more depth as well, with the backstory involving his past as an Umbrella employee completely oblivious to what his work was being used for. Even Krauser has received a pretty great update, and while he still kinda comes out of nowhere, he feels much less of a cartoon villain this time around. His motivations and backstory are much more fleshed out. The only exception to this is, unfortunately, Ada. They don't really do much with her character at all, which is so disappointing coming off of the Resident Evil 2 remake, which made her one of my favorite characters in that game. She clearly was not given the same amount of attention here, and that sucks, because this game is where she arguably needed it the most. The voice actress is a huge downgrade from the 2 remake as well. She's unfortunately been harassed quite a bit online since the game's release, which is absolutely unfair. But that also doesn't mean this is a good performance. I have to echo the common consensus here, she sounds really bored and uninterested in every scene, and it's especially bad when compared to the original game.
Put your hands where I can see them.
Sorry, but following a lady's lead just isn't my style.
Put them up now.
You can stop right there, Leon. Wouldn't make me use this, would you?
Thankfully, the rest of the voice acting is excellent. Nick Apostolides reprises his role as Leon from the RE2 remake and is fantastic once again. His tone here is quite different in this game to reflect how the character has changed, but it feels like a natural evolution. Everybody else is equally pretty great here. Performances are consistently charismatic and go a long way into making everybody so fun to watch. Characterization is arguably the remake's greatest improvement. So while everything I've talked about up to this point has been very important, the main core of RE4 has always been about how well it played. The resource management, the gunplay, the constant decision making. Every aspect of the core gameplay loop is vital to making the incredibly well-crafted experience that is Resident Evil 4. And thankfully, the remake is able to take that foundation and transform it into something that is just as much fun as the original. If there's one point of contention of the original game for modern audiences, it's the controls. I played 4 for the first time after marathoning the original trilogy, so I was already well accustomed to the infamous tank controls of those games. And because of that, I always thought that Resident Evil 4 controlled extremely well. It's basically a direct translation of the older games, only now you could aim your shots. And for that reason, I've always appreciated it, and I feel like adapting to this control scheme today still proves to be a ton of fun. However, I also understand why players picking up the game more recently may take some issue with it. The game does lock you pretty firmly to moving in 8 directions, and it may feel stiff to those more used to games taking up the full range of the analog stick. Another sticking point for these players is the inability to move and shoot at the same time. So, for people with these issues, the remake will automatically be much more appealing, since it uses pretty much the same movement system as the RE2 remake, which means full analog control and the ability to move and shoot at the same time. Thankfully, unlike the RE2 remake, enemies are actually really fun to fight this time around. For one thing, they go down way more quickly than in that game, so they're not so annoying to work around. For another, you're likely going to be carrying way more weapons thanks to RE4's much more forgiving inventory system, so you'll have plenty of options available to take them out. And this amount of weapons is a lot of fun, but it definitely does not make the game mindless, because you'll always have to be carefully considering how much ammo you're expending for each weapon. Sure, you can get really comfortable with one weapon, but rely on it exclusively and you're going to run out of ammo and have to pivot to another strategy. You'll have to consider what weapons are best for what situations, if it's worth spending ammo, or if it's more beneficial to save it for later. Ammo can be pretty scarce too, and blowing through it all can easily leave you stranded with nothing. Even if you're not being careless, you can still end up finding yourself really low on supplies at points. And on top of that, everything that you do have has to be managed in the limited space provided with your attaché case. So not only do you have to keep track of what you have at all times, you have to make sure that you have all the appropriate space for it. There are a lot of mental gymnastics going on at every moment, but combined with the incredibly satisfying shooting mechanics, Resident Evil 4 is an incredibly fun and addicting game. Now, most of what I just said can be applied to both the original and the remake, but the remake takes that fantastic foundation and pushes it even further. On a simple level, ammo is even more scarce than in the original, but there is a lot more going on than just that. Knives especially take on a very different role here than in the original. Before, there was just one, and it was mostly useful as a way to deal supplemental damage to an enemy while they're already grounded. Here, there's still one primary knife that will stick with you through the whole game, but now it has a durability meter, and you can only use it a certain amount of times before it breaks, and you'll have to bring it to the merchant to repair it. There's a lot more that you can do with it though, specifically parrying. This is huge. It's a new addition to the remake that lets you avoid pretty much all damage if you're good enough with the timing. It can even block attacks that will normally take you out in one hit, like the chainsaw. It's not a crutch to lean on though, because using this mechanic too much will degrade the knife's durability. So using the knife has to constantly be a conscious decision, and it's just like using another gun. Do you use it to attack and take care of enemies before they become a bigger threat? Or do you save that energy for a parry that could save your life? This gets even more complicated when you start finding smaller, less durable knives to use that can't be repaired. It adds yet another level of decision making, and it's great. So the mechanics are amazing, and the level design matches them perfectly. I recently heard the areas in this game described as jungle gyms, and that's kind of the perfect way to put it. There are so many things to maneuver around and vault over, and that alone becomes its own kind of game. It can be really satisfying to use knowledge of level layouts to crowd control, and all the area layouts naturally lead to very fun and dynamic encounters, and there's always multiple ways through them. There's even a ton of fun and dynamic ways to interact with level-specific environments, so if you're quick on your feet and good at observing your surroundings, you can make some really fun things happen. The levels encourage you to think critically about everything you're doing, and it's yet another reason that Resident Evil 4 is just so much fun. There's a lot of mid-level set pieces too, and I found these to usually be a lot of fun. Some of these were in the original as well, but I never found them as enjoyable as I did here. I think this minecart sequence is the biggest upgrade. They turned it into one of my favorite moments in the game. It's a lot more intense now because you actually have to work around constantly moving targets. And while I'm not exactly sure if this counts as a set piece, the section where you have to play as Ashley has been greatly improved too. The breaks away from the main action are always refreshing because they never last long enough to be intrusive, so they're always welcome detours. Here's where things get a bit tricky though. On the fundamental level, I feel like the remake accomplishes exactly the same thing as the original when it comes to the gameplay, but in practice they end up feeling quite different. It's pretty difficult to describe without having played both games, but weapons in the original felt a lot more punchy than in the remake. I've heard the original's gunplay described as arcadey as well, and I think that gets the point across pretty well too. The remake's guns feel a lot more grounded and realistic, and end up losing a bit of that impact as a result. I definitely would not call it bad, and it's still a ton of fun, but there is just something special about the original that's not quite intact here. In fact, I think that's the best way to describe the RE4 remake in general. It is amazing, and it will no doubt be one of the strongest contenders for 2023's Game of the Year title. But there's just something missing to the point where it can't quite replace the original game. From the over-the-top campiness to the arcadey gunplay to the atmosphere and the sound design, the original Resident Evil 4 still has plenty of aspects that are notably different from the remake. Some would even argue better. So this remake just can't replace the original. But honestly, I don't think it was ever trying to. The original Resident Evil 4 has been ported pretty much everywhere you can imagine, including all modern consoles and PC. So you want to play the original game? Go right ahead, there's nothing stopping you, and it's quite a bit cheaper than the remake too. The remake seems to have been designed with the intention of being an alternate version of Resident Evil 4, and in that regard, it's pretty much as good as I could have ever hoped. For every area I can think of that I prefer the original, I can think of another where I prefer the remake. I genuinely can't bring myself to pick a favorite from the two. I love them both. No matter what version you play, Resident Evil 4 is one of the best action horror games ever made. It's definitely not the scariest thing out there, but it really doesn't matter when the game is just so much fun in every single aspect. The gameplay's fun, of course, but so are the characters, the dialogue, the setting, everything about it. And that goes for both versions. This remake doesn't replace the original, but it only adds to the game's legacy.